Well, we are back here in the future, here on the Drive-Thru 301, a new era here on the Drive-Thru, of course. And we're going to discuss the latest episode of Dark Side of the Ring. This week featuring, is it about Abdullah the Butcher or is it about the incident with him and Hannibal? What is the actual topic of the show?
Swing and a miss. Sorry, boys, Evan, Jason. And I mean, hopefully my expectations were to, as in a lot of these episodes, learn something that even I didn't know that I care about the subject of the episode or the incident or whatever in question. And I'm a chronological person, Brian. I like to start at the beginning of a story and kind of progress through it to the end. And this was all over the decades. And you got a basic superficial understanding of that Abdullah the Butcher was, yes, a big star in the business, and he was scary and violent and made people bleed and bled everywhere he went and was big in Japan. The most basic of details. And they had... the talking heads were, except for Tony Atlas. Tony worked with Abby a bunch, but he wasn't like intertwined in his life, but they had family members. They had Mick Foley, who rode with Abby for, years and years when they were, well, not years, but some time when they were in WCW and or Japan together or etc. And they had access to all that cool footage, which to me at least saved it, because you see, stuff that the WWE has not beaten to death on their documentaries on these shows. But the fascinating childhood and his entrance into the wrestling business, was kind of glossed over. 8 kids living they had a picture of it, a fucking shack. The little brother was sleeping in the bathtub. That was pretty quickly gone by. And by the way, it's amazing to me that Abby has a family. Even somebody Abby was one of the guys that you didn't know that much about. And to see his brother speaking. And thankfully he, in a previous career, he played the mayor of Munchkinland, Brian. You remember in that famous movie from MGM.
Will you stop and leave him alone?
But see, that's why when you heard Abby talk, that's why you never heard Abdullah the Butcher speak, because his voice didn't match the look. That was the only thing about him that didn't add up. And so he was just mute and or gibberish and scared people with his face. Anyway, Abby hustling when he was a kid, selling candy to the kids in school. They had that in there, but fascinating childhood. And then he meets the Sheik and, great Sheik footage. But at the same time, then that's completely glossed over. And suddenly in 12 minutes into the show, we're in Puerto Rico in 1983. And then the footage from then on was jumping back and forth from eras and different places just as highlights, but there was no detail really given of his career or insight into why Abby was over. And Abdullah the Butcher, if you evaluated him as a worker based on working a pro wrestling match like everybody else, he was fucking rotten. But if you evaluated him based on working a gimmick to perfection, he was one of the best ever. And people who didn't live in this era of the 60s, 70s, and early mid-80s of, when Abby was on top, the fans who did, and now some of the people in the business, including very high up positions in the business, who didn't live this in the time, in the era, they see these highlights, and that's why they think that wrestling was always like this everywhere. And because they have no context, they weren't in real time, as they say. living from the 1 week to the next week 1-hour TV program, or seeing your monthly matches at the arena or your weekly matches. And Abby, like the Sheik, except in Detroit where the Sheik owned. And he loved Abby because they worked that style. They never stayed in a territory very long. You couldn't do that because it was like the Mighty Igor gimmick. There wasn't enough Mighty Igor to go around, so Ivan Putski came along. Or the Rock and Roll Express, and then there was the Rockers and the Fantastic. There was always in the territories with 25 or 30 different places to work in Puerto Rico and Japan. If a gimmick got over, there were a few guys that would adopt it. But those guys, the hardcore guys, the Sheik, Abby, Wild Bull Curry, Crazy, Moondogs, they either overlapped eras where they weren't all doing it at the same time, or they were never in the same territory at the same time. When they came in for a specific run and didn't stay long. Because if you did that all the time, you would kill the fucking territory. Brian, have I explained that? That a few guys were allowed to do it on a limited basis in a wide variety of places. That's why it worked. You couldn't do it all the time. That's what ended up dooming the Sheik, among a few other things.
Yeah, I guess that's the big difference. The Sheik stayed home. Abdullah the Butcher was in different places for limited periods of time.
And because when he came in, it was chaos, and it was violent, and it was bloody. It got over, and then he'd leave, but then you could tease it. He came in as special mystery opponents or special tag team partners or to collect a bounty. Or to an evil manager like Gary Hart would have him do the bidding, whatever. And it worked because he had a name and a reputation as being that. And then boom, it would come in and it would go again. And it would draw. And he didn't work. Although I saw him in Georgia work a spot show, and Abby in a high school gym in front of 500 people with no blood and not really giving a shit didn't work. But in the big shows, that was the thing. They also gave no context on why the Sheik worked or why Abdullah the Butcher worked the ultraviolet madman, foreign menace, non-speaking, whatever. It's because Carlos Colon in Puerto Rico was the island's hero. And they had an emotional connection with him. And they lived and died with his victories or his defeats. And when you bring a monster in to face your hero, you get worried about your hero. Abby was the monster, and people were legitimately scared of him. That's the point they made in the program. Fans and some of the boys alike, when he would get going. And my God, just that meat cleaver elbow with 400 pounds coming down on you. And he was very firm with it. But that was part of the aura. Mick Foley said it best. He said, fans were not worried their hero would get beat. Fans were worried their hero would get hurt, I believe, or whatever, or not survive. So that's why that worked. It wasn't just, if you didn't know anything about wrestling and you watched the show and the highlights, you would just think that it was this guy that just came and got it together in the ring with this other guy, and people were loving it just because they were stabbing each other with forks and slicing each other up with razor blades, and not how it got to that point and why the people cared. Brian, is that a fair assessment?
I think so. Tony Atlas brought up the fact that people who worked with Abdullah got over. One of the examples not used here was Tommy Rich in Atlanta.
Oh, God, yeah.
I mean, that's what got Tommy Rich over in Atlanta, was Abdullah the Butcher.
Well, and in Tommy Rich, you had this young, and remember in Georgia in the late 70s, it was Mr. Wrestling 2. And it was, Dusty Rhodes, but he wasn't a pretty boy in that sense. Tommy Rich was 21 years old or 20 years old when he left Tennessee and went down there, and the girls loved him, and he was the blonde-haired baby face of all time in Georgia at that point. And to put him in the ring with this fucking giant, bleeding, drooling, chaotic monster, people were shitting themselves, and the girls would cry. when Tommy loved to fucking bleed too, and he would sell, and the sweat in his face, and he learned that Jerry Jarrett fucking Ricky Morton style Tennessee babyface selling. And you would see the teenage girls jumping up and down, crying tears when Abby was stabbing him in the head with a fucking fork. Anyway, but that's the context of all of this. It wasn't illustrated for anybody that wouldn't know. And as I said, who didn't live, watching wrestling in that time, you'd think you were able to see this every week on every TV show that you watched. And people think that because it's all national now, it was all national then. Most people didn't see any of this, only in the area it was broadcast. And then the TBS stuff. But Abby's, his prime of his career was what? 67, 68, when he really started getting over in Michigan, Ontario. And by the mid-'80s, that last run with Crockett, when WCW brought him back, it was comedy. I remember I was doing an interview one time with him, and I think him and Mick Foley. I was conducting the interview, and he's fucking digging in my pocket and my jacket, and I'm freaking out, and finally he comes out with my spare Twinkies, right? That was a thing they wanted us to do. And they put him in the electric chair, and by then the aura was over, but he at that age, he couldn't be, except in Japan, what he once was in the United States, because he was too old and it wasn't allowed anymore.
And that was a babyface run in 1990 in WCW.
Yes, which was, and he worked as a babyface when you'd bring him in as a special partner against heels that had heat. And then the babyface would go, but no, I'm just saying that he worked in his time that way also.
Well, this was him being friends with Trucker Norman and Captain Mike Rotunda.
Yeah, well, that's why I said, it was all being played for laughs at that point, and it was over in the United States. Japan, they still believed him. But anyway, and they showed some of the Japanese TV commercials at his record album, and I mean, my God, the cartoons, the people there, he got over on several levels. Wrestling was so hot. They always, in Japan, liked monsters, Godzilla, whatever the fuck, he fit that. And then the preposterousness of him being put in these, other positions doing these commercials, it just, it all worked over there for him. But we got a bunch of, and let me say, before we get into the meat of the matter, they mentioned that he never worked for the WWF, and he never worked for the WWF either, Vince Sr., correct? Did he ever, anywhere?
I don't believe so.
I can't off the top of my head think of it. He wouldn't have worked there. Even in the WWF of the 70s, under Vince Sr., where yes, they did have blood, and they did have, Killer Kowalski and Bruno were doing chair angles and whatever the fuck. Abby, it would have been too, I think he would have caused riots. He would have caused a riot in Madison Square Garden, probably in Boston, probably in Philadelphia, because those people were fucking, that was a rough crowd in those days. We've heard all the stories. Blackjack Mulligan got fucking, cut for 200 stitches in Boston. Can you imagine if Abby had tried to do all the shit he did and, butcher fucking Pedro? But it also, it wouldn't have worked in the 80s under Vince Jr. because, yes, they would have got some humorous Tuesday Night Titans footage out of it, but it would have killed Abby's aura, and I think he was young enough at that point he wasn't going to do that, because he was still making money in Japan and worked for Crockett in the mid-'80s and had a variety of, means to make money. Can you imagine it ever working there? And him not wanting to do jobs.
If he was willing to do jobs, it could work. Style-wise, it wouldn't work. If he would willingly give up the blade, could I see him having a very short run in the 1980s? Yeah. I mean, look, they gave everyone a chance. Give him a manager, let him do his thing. Would Hogan want to work with him? Hogan liked to work with guys who were safe, who he didn't have a problem with. He knew Abdullah from Japan. I don't know if that would be someone Hogan would want to do a tour with.
And the thing is, Abby would sell now for baby faces, especially on their comeback. And if they had fire, and remember, he could take a monkey flip. He was still doing that when he was working for Crockett in 85.
And how old was he there?
Well, nobody knows. Remember when he died? When he died,
really?
Jesus Christ!
This is Dark Side of the Drive-Thru.
It was when he oh Jesus! I'll try that again. When they just had the goddamn deal where nobody knows. I was talking to Evan Husney, as a matter of fact, about it. Is that they don't know exactly for sure what his birthday is from some issue or something. I don't know, but he's 80 probably. So 37 years ago, he would have mid 40s, and at 440 pounds.
That's the thing. Abdullah in the 70s is very different from Abdullah in the 80s, let alone the 90s. So if we're talking Abdullah in the 70s, again, no blade. Could a short program with him and Bruno or him and Pedro have worked? Possibly. Pedro's whole run was just short programs with people. And then in the 80s, it's all about Hogan. I mean, that'd really be the only person he'd be working with, unless he's doing a mid-card feud with upper mid-card feud, or like a Ricky Steamboat or something. Junkyard Dog, I couldn't imagine those matches. But
well, yeah, there was a window you've seen the pictures, and this is why I wish we had more footage. There was the Australia stuff in black and white, but 67, 68, 69 Abby in the butcher pants and the sash, and I think there's one publicity picture he had a fucking saber or whatever.
Like a Cornette convention watcher.
Well, yeah, he was starting a trend early. But he was like, what, maybe 300 pounds, 320. You see the early pictures.
I wouldn't say svelte, but considering what he turned into, he looks svelte.
Yes, and it's shocking because you think, and you see the higher elbow drop pictures from, was that Montreal or was it Toronto, wherever it was.
Remember, he became a big star in Stampede. After the Stomper Archie Goldie, it was Abdullah the Butcher as the
That's right. And he had to be able to move at that point in Stampede, and he could. But as he got, and he didn't do the blood every night then. There was a period of time, if the New York promoters and Vince Sr. had ever really seen him or considered him, he and Bruno in the late 60s would have been interesting. But he wasn't that big of a name yet. And as he got bigger physically and bigger name-wise and got the gimmick full-fledged, it wasn't going to work.
But the other thing, too, is when you look at guys in the 80s in the WWF, the reputation became fair or unfair, that they were working a softer style, a different style. They were on the road every day. Those are hard rings. They don't have to really improvise like they were working for Bill Watts or something. They can kind of just coast. In a lot of ways, I think for Abdullah the Butcher, the Blade was that.
Yeah.
Because he couldn't do the stuff he did in the 70s. He could just grab Bruiser Brody in a headlock and they can cut each other and walk around the building.
And that's why also you couldn't do that regularly in any one place except for Japan, where it was evergreen, because once people had kind of seen that over here, they needed more. And it was chaos because you never saw it. And, oh my God. But then we went back to regular, and that was what sustained the business. And then you could pop something with, oh, here's more chaos. Anyway, and let's talk about the controversy first. Can he read and write or not?
He can read. We went to a restaurant. I saw him read a menu, and then he asked for a hamburger. Clearly he can read. He wanted fries on the side.
Oh, we'll get to that part of it.
He can read.
And here's the thing. It was a surprise to everybody in the wrestling business that was interviewed when they heard that he couldn't read or write. And who was it? I think it was even Mick that said he had just heard that story recently, or maybe Hugo Savinovich, who also spent a lot of time with
Mick.
Puerto Rico. It was Mick.
It was Mick.
And also, this is what I'm not taking up for Abdullah. Abdullah and I have had professional interaction, never had a crossword. Didn't know him that well, worked in the various places at the same time.
Shook his hand, cut every finger.
No, he never cut me. So I got no dog in this fight. And I've never met old Hannibal Lecter either, but we've had interaction on the internet. We'll get to that. But the point is, this is what I consider a heel program. When both sides of an issue are in some way stunningly full of shit, it's a heel program. It's heel versus heel, right? And Cactus and everybody else at Abby could read menus, not even to be funny, but just, yes, we've been with this guy, he read menus, but also he ran a business. The House of Chicken and Ribs was open for quite some time, and it wasn't just, you didn't walk in and see Abby at the grill and handing you your food. He had people working for him. And as well, plane tickets. When he was a major star and flying around different places, and I've traveled through airports with him. He didn't have like a handler or somebody leading him around with a rope. And by the way, I've told this story about Barbarian, but you know how Abby's plane tickets were made out in the 80s, at least, because I've seen one.
No.
You know how when it used to be a paper ticket.
Yeah.
Right. And you would have your name of the passenger at the upper left-hand side, and it'd be last name first / first name. Right.
Sure. They were doing that into the 90s, at least.
Yeah. It would be made out butcher / A. And now people are going to call bullshit. No, before 2001, there was all kinds of shit going on with the airlines that you would think now would land you in jail, and they didn't even look at it. And they used to fucking make plane tickets out for a guy like that, because I was traveling with the Barbarian. We were at the gate for a flight. We worked for Crockett, right? And they had to, I don't know whether they had to change his seat or whatever, but they paged him. And they literally got on there and said, "Is there a Barbarian at gate 42? A Barbarian, please come to the desk at gate 42. And I have flown as Ole Anderson. When they would buy plane tickets at Crockett's office and the card would get changed and somebody else would need to go, they'd give those tickets to that. So here, you're Ole, fly as Ole Anderson. If they ask you, just say, "Yeah, that's my name."
Just say, "Fuck you."
Yeah, and they know. But no, and then you just hand them the fucking ticket as Ole Anderson, the pass friend, and you get right on the fucking plane. This was 1985.
I met Abdullah in an airport once.
What did he say?
It was coming back from Fan Week in 95. Me and Marty Gorman flew from Knoxville to Atlanta to switch planes to go to, I believe, LaGuardia. I don't think it was Kennedy. I think we were going there. And next thing you know, there's a giant man in a white suit and a cigar in his mouth, but he's not smoking it. It's just an unlit cigar. And I'm like, man, that's fucking Abdullah the Butcher. I had just been hanging out with Masahori at Fan Week. I had the latest Japanese magazines.
Oh, my God.
So I went up to him and I said, "Excuse me, Abdullah." And I knew what to say right away. "I'm friends with Masa." That'll disarm him. I said, "I'm friends with Masa. I was just hanging out with him in Knoxville. How are you?" "Oh, hey, brother." He's just very nice. I asked him to sign the thing, and he signed it, Mr. A. Butcher. And while this was happening, there were two women behind him looking at me, and they were just going, like, mouthing the words, "Who is that? Who is that?" And I didn't have the heart to tell them it was Solomon Burke.
Oh, all righty then. And see, that's the thing. If you had probably not said, Masa's name, or maybe flashed the Japanese magazines, he would have looked at you with the big bug eyes and scared you away, because that's the thing.
Marty Gorman was hiding. He wouldn't come near him.
and a good thing he did, because he probably wouldn't have been as nice to Marty. I remember Marty's pleasing social skills, but that's the thing, is he would work his gimmick in and out of the ring and in public places. And, Mick told the story of him scaring the stewardess just, with the face and everything, because he wanted people to believe we were talking about the reading and writing. He signed autographs, A. Butcher, I've got a Polaroid taken of him chewing on my head.
Mr. A. Butcher.
Mr. A. Butcher. I just, after all those years, I can understand if he wasn't the most literate writer or, whatever, is going to read goddamn scripture. But functionality, one would think, and besides that,
Well,
he's been in the wrestling business for 40 years. He's getting letters that are clearly return addressed from a fucking court of some description in his home province. One would think he would have had curiosity to have somebody investigate it before that. Okay, I'm just going to say this, in the old days, when he started in the business and for a good period of time before the internet, if you got sued, you ignored it and left the territory. And you got away with it in most cases.
that's what he did. He left Canada. No, what I was going to say is, I think if you ever see anything on TV about people battling illiteracy as adults, let alone a senior citizen, there are ways to hide it. There are people who mask it from everyone for years, and it ends up being maybe there's some level of functional literacy, but they couldn't sit down and read a book. They couldn't read the newspaper.
Right.
They couldn't read stuff. So, I don't want to accuse Abdullah just being full of shit on this. We don't know, but there's a chance.
I'm saying that Abdullah the Butcher is one of the great workers of all time, and I think he functionally has been able to get along, and he probably is limited in terms of his literacy skills. But at the same time, if you're getting letters, I've gotten a number of letters from law firms and lawsuits and official documents, and it looks stern enough that if it was written in goddamn Greek or Hebrew, one would want to find out what the fuck this is about.
Oh, I should drop out of school in the 2nd grade, which is what they claimed here.
And then spent 40 years in the wrestling business. All right. Well,
I didn't pause for dramatic reasons. There's a giant lawnmower somewhere.
Oh, okay. The giant lawnmower is back.
It's the giant lawnmower. It's not me.
How big a boy is he?
Oh, my God. It's coming for me now.
He's almost 7 feet tall.
I'm about the biggest goddamn man you've ever seen. Look in the rearview mirror.
All right, but that's the thing. Abdullah the Butcher, as working his gimmick for years and years, was one of the best in the business and made an impact for the reasons that we've explained, and because that he was so good at what he did in that aspect. And again, half of the show, now we might as well talk about it, was about his interaction with this fucking psychologically warped dipshit that we then had to listen to. We're watching a show about one of the biggest stars of wrestling, and we've got to put up with this for. Do you know what a vanity press used to be, Brian? You're a very literate man. You know what, before publishing became, desktop and self-publishing became a thing, and printing costs not only came down, but you can fucking rip things off the drop of a hat now. Back in the old days, if you were an aspiring writer, you couldn't just publish your own book. You had to get an actual publisher to do it for you, and to even to get it printed, much less to sell it anywhere. And so they had vanity presses where people who didn't really have the talent enough to go to a real publisher and publish a book or have a book published that would potentially sell, they just wrote some shit and they want to pay the publishing company to publish it and give them 1,000 copies or whatever. This fucking guy is the goddamn wrestling equivalent of a vanity press.
That's my new finisher. The vanity press.
1, 2, 3 every time, because he's covering no one. He got into business and worked some outlaw shows, and then he started his own promotion so he could work for himself. And Abby's interaction with him was because this guy is always, you can tell he's a mark, not only for himself, but just a mark to wrestling. And of course, Slow Devin is not going to tell the story this way, but obviously the story is this way. Abdullah the Butcher in 2006, was not going to fucking come to goddamn Canada and wrestle somebody at the age of 60, fucking almost 70, and wrestle some fucking idiot unless the idiot paid him a lot of money. Because that's one thing about Abby. And they say now he's broke and in bad physical condition. Abdullah the Butcher was always noted in the wrestling business as a guy that got every penny that was coming to him and every penny he could for anything that he did. And so I'm sure because this fucking weirdo is a mark for himself and his gimmick, the Blood Hunter. And we'll more on that later.
Yeah.
In a case of fucking irony.
John Moxley turns me on.
Oh,
so much blood.
It's the blood. And so he pays Abby a ridiculous amount of money to get him to come up there and have a fucking juice match with him because that's the guy's fucking deal, right? I don't want to say fetish or whatever.
I called leapfrog. He cut me.
And Abby did what he did with every other promoter and any mark willing to pay him to do anything. He's okay, brother. I'll come have my retirement match for you. Because he said, I retired Abdullah the Butcher. How many matches had Abdullah the Butcher worked in 2006 in the previous 10 fucking years? He was almost 70 and a fucking grossly obese man with, I'm sure, some kind of many issues physically. So the guy pays him to come up and have a double juice match with him, and then is talking like when he saw the video, that's when he became aware that Abdullah the Butcher had gigged him. What the fuck is the whole fucking idea of the thing? Why would you pay this fucking retired, nearly 70-year-old fucking man who just a couple of years later, when I saw him at a fan fest, was being wheeled around in a wheelchair to go to Canada and work on your show that you promoted, unless it was to have the double juice match and retire, in quotes, Abdullah the Butcher. And that's this fucking guy's deal. Remember, we've talked about he would fly himself to that promotion in Texas and pay his opponent and pay his manager. And that's how he got on shows. Selena De Laurentiis, I had to finally say, fuck it.
Where is she? I'm looking for her. Oh.
She said, fuck you. I quit. Because you're getting blood all over my fucking expensive clothes that nobody even knows is coming.
Send me an invoice.
Yeah. So he legitimately believes that he would have been a WWE superstar if his blood test hadn't come back positive for hepatitis C. And then so sues Abdullah the Butcher. Now, here's the thing. If Abby did give him hepatitis, well, besides it doing the WWF a favor, then that's fine. Abby got fucking sued and lost. He ain't paying the guy. I don't have a dog in the fight. I don't care what happens either way. What I'm saying is that it is ludicrous for anybody to be expected to believe that Devin and Abby both didn't have that match, knowing what was going to fucking happen. And since Devin has proven that he cuts himself and other people with regularity, then it seems like that he either would have done it himself or he knew Abby was going to do it.
Bingo.
And he probably marked out Abdullah the Butcher's going to blade me. That's so cool. I'm sorry, I'm doing your gimmick.
He's my mentor. Cut me, mentor.
So, and then, of course, Slow Devin shows and explains the blade and cuts it and tapes it. And of course, it's a very sloppy looking job. That's why all of his people apparently complain that he's fucking trying to kill him.
Move over, Eddie Mansfield.
Well, he looked like a short bus Eddie Mansfield there. Is basically what he looked like. Only Mansfield at least had the guts to go ahead and do it on camera. Hannibal likes to do it in the ring, wouldn't do it on camera. So I'm not Abdullah the Butcher.
I had an important meeting.
But basically, so Abby took his money and worked with him like he did any other mark ever in the business. And everybody knows they knew what the fuck was going on because that was the point of the thing. And then the WWE contract that he was offered was developmental. It wasn't like he was going to debut on Raw, and it's like he still believes, and you can tell, look, because he's not that good an actor or worker, and he's not even that good a speaker. You can tell on his face that he believes he would be goddamn John Cena fucking Roman Reigns level if it wasn't for that bad blood test preventing him from going to developmental, where they wouldn't have kept him 6 months until they dropped him for either being an idiot, a mark, or a mental case, because he's proven himself to be all three.
Abdullah cost me my deal with developmental. Now I'm developmentally disabled.
And he's rotten. He's a rotten fucking wrestler. We've seen the video. They showed old video where he was rotten, and he's rotten now. And then,
can I say something, though?
Please do.
All kidding aside, I heard from someone in the business a long while back because they heard one of the segments I did on 605 about this goof because he tried to have a run at me and I made him look like a fool multiple times.
Well, now, Mother Nature beat you to it.
Well, that's true. Someone in the business said, we always wondered, how could you prove Abdullah gave it to you? You had all these blood matches with all these different guys. There are various people in wrestling, I hate to say this, who have blood-borne diseases. We saw Bob Orton Sr. get in trouble with WWE like 15 years ago. The Undertaker flipped out.
No.
Bob Orton Jr., excuse me. Bob Orton Jr.
Don't malign the man. He's 110.
We saw the Zodiac go down. No, we saw Bob Orton Jr. He was doing a thing with Randy and The Undertaker, and The Undertaker flipped out because he was exposed to hepatitis C.
Yeah.
Because he didn't know Bob Orton Jr. had it. I don't know
Bob
who else.
Didn't either.
I don't know who else would have. And that's the point. There are a lot of people, especially from guys who use the blade a lot and may have shared the blade. There are a lot of people out there. So to say Abdullah gave me this specific hepatitis C, that's the only thing I've always wondered. How can you say that when you did blood matches with so many different people? How many other wrestlers were tested? Guys that you worked with before Abdullah or after Abdullah?
I have no idea, and I ain't a doctor. I'm just a small town bird lawyer. But the point is, this is Tony Atlas kind of moderately put it best. I can't actually say phrased it best. A lot of people think it'd be like it is, but it do or whatever. But he said, you get in this business, you're taking a risk. He specifically booked this match to happen for him to bleed with Abdullah the Butcher, is what I'm saying. So regardless of who gave what to who, or who flew over the cuckoo's nest, now you sue the fucking guy. And in the ironic turn of events, they did include at the end of the program where this moron, and we've heard multiple stories, he got arrested last year for physically assaulting his girlfriend, a young lady that was with him. I don't want to cast aspersions on her, categorizing her as a girlfriend.
I was just trying to help her. Realign her spine.
They didn't mention that, but they did mention his previous incident where he stabbed that referee on that outlaw show in Texas in the head with a spike, severing one of his arteries and chewing his whole head up.
He's a bleeder.
And did you like Lance Storm's audio from a podcast? They played the audio where he eviscerated this fucking guy. Say, why is he not in jail, and why would he ever be booked again? How can you explain this? And the guy continues to still sit there and lie to the camera and blame other people and prevaricate and eviscerate and all those other eights about the shit that he has done. And I just had one of the cult members tweet me this morning after they saw this fucking show, said, my God, the stories of the way he's fucked people around and or gone into business for himself because of his own delusions on all those, his own shows that he runs around there are insane.
I don't care if you are cured of hepatitis C, which is what he says he is, and I'm going to take him at his word for that.
Because of experimental treatments.
Even if you are, why would you go back and do blood stuff? That seems like the worst idea.
His and other people's.
Yeah. Why would you do that?
And other people's. Did you not learn your lesson? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Gomer Pyle is smarter than Hannibal. We've come to that fucking conclusion here. From his own chicken lips, slurring his own words.
I watch Gomer Pyle while I eat my crayons.
All right, but so that... I didn't really learn anything I didn't know about Abby. There was some nice old footage, but in no context. And we had to listen to Lurch piss and moan and bemoan his fate about what a star he would have been if not, it was not taken all away from him by something that he arranged and promoted and paid the guy to do.
And he was never going to be a WWE star. I think anyone who can look at this, from a distance, or anyone who knows him or anything about this, like you said, he wouldn't have survived developmental because he would have alienated other people there. They wouldn't want to be around him. He's a weird guy. Everyone who's around him says he's a weird guy. He's going to be around all those.
He's a weird guy that pays people to be around him. And that's, and people in the wrestling business will take money from marks. And whether he's paying people to talk to him on Skype, or he's paying people to fucking work on his shows, or he's paying people to let him work on their shows.
The Canadian Casati.
Oh, for 17 people in New Jersey, that's hilarious. Closing thoughts on Abdullah the Butcher?
I think this is one of the problems with the concept going forward. There were two separate things here. The story of Abdullah the Butcher's life was intriguing. I mean, again, dropped out at second grade, was doing just all these things. Even if you get into some of the bad stuff, there was a story there that just all of a sudden took an abrupt course change, and it became about the Hannibal Abdullah the Butcher incident and the fallout, and even that didn't go too deep into it. I think they should have either done a special about Abdullah or a special about Hannibal. And with Hannibal, it's the same thing. You could have done what he says happened to him, and you could have done what there's plenty of footage of him doing to other people. And I think go ahead.
Let me just jump in there and say you're right. And the more you hear him speak, the lower your opinion becomes of him. So for a whole hour, he pretty much could have told his whole story.
I hope he dies a painful death.
And then you see Abdullah's sisters he got us food when we were poor, and he did this and that. Like, geez, I don't know. There's some middle ground here somewhere. Everyone's a worker. And again, the reenactments, the most ridiculous one that tops the previous ridiculous one is Abdullah in the rain of blood with the red light jabbing himself in the head, which they showed multiple times. They must be really proud of that one.
Oh, I'm not sure that Abby was sitting at home going, boy, that looks like me. Because it accentuated his mud flaps without having the whole, but that's another thing in wrestling. And let's close up with this. It used to be that no matter what territory it was, what wrestling promotion it was, what organization, most of the people on the card didn't look like average, normal fucking people. Where else would you ever see somebody that looked like Abdullah the Butcher running around in butcher pants and a fucking Arab headdress and fucking chasing people with a fucking fork? Now everybody from NXT UK looks like they just graduated from accounting school. You know what would have been the best thing for Abby to do?
The best thing for Abby to do? No, I don't.
The best thing for Abdullah to do when he got, and we call him Abby in the business fondly, and to his face. That was, it wasn't and I'm not being flippant here. But when he was getting all those letters, if his caretaker had managed to find him and read them to him before then, he needed to hire a good lawyer. See, that's the problem, because old Slow Devin up in Ontario, he got some ambulance chaser that had all this experience. If Abby had had a good lawyer, he could have got this thing shut down, boom, just like that. If only Abdullah the Butcher had known at that time about the man, the myth, the legend.
Call Stephen P. News. If you need to sue. An outlaw mud show or two. Still to the rest.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, if only Abdullah the Butcher had known the most important numbers in all of the numerical alphabet. 888-692-8084. Or if he had been able to type into his keyboard, newlawoffice.com, then he would have been saved from strife and potential poverty and ruin and destitutionaryism and destrucity. Because Stephen P. New would have ridden to his rescue like a West Virginia knight in shining armor and carried the banner or the saber or the meat cleaver of justice up there to Ontario and smack that bitch down. And he can do the same thing for you. Whether you have a bitch or a bastard or anybody else you need smacked down, Brother Stephen P. New will smacketh the layeth or layeth the smacketh. He'll drop a leg right on the offending party, and he'll be on it quick, too, much like he was on Colin Thompson of Cast Media, who owes a lot of people money and is probably going to pay something to Stephen, or if you can't get blood out of a turnip, he'll squeeze your fucking testicles until they produce some kind of liquid.
Colin Thompson, the wimpy dirtbag we're going to nail.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're not going to nail him in that kind of high school locker room way.
What?
We're going to nail him to the wall in a legal way.
What was going on in your locker room?
Yeah, well, you know, sometimes, Johnny Valentine. So anyway, if you need to nail somebody to the wall, legally that is, or potentially after hours in a separate arrangement in cash, non-sequential serial numbers, nobody has to know, then the person to nail that son of a bitch to the wall is Stephen P. New at newlawoffice.com, 888-692-8084. And if you've just had something easy and simple happen, like wrongful termination, or you've been given cancer by chemicals left by some major corporation, then he does that too. But if somebody owes you money, call him up. He'll collect one way or the other. I hate to tell you all the things that happened to that fucking last guy.